Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. Okay, on the show today, Gina Ross. So Gina Ross is really very well qualified as a trauma therapist and she's interested in conflict, and she's the head of two trauma organizations, one in Israel, one in the US, I believe, and also is a senior trainer with Somatic Experiencing, which is most famously associated with Peter Levine. So Gina, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me on.
And how did you get interested in the subject of trauma, and particularly trauma in the body?
Yeah, that's very interesting, actually, how it started, because I really didn't care about the subject of trauma at all. I was very much involved with helping people become more spiritual. And then I realized that if they're traumatized, then it's not an easy contact. It's not an easy connection to become spiritual if we're traumatized. So I started getting interested in the subject of trauma and its cause because of that. And then by chance, I ended up meeting Peter Levine in a workshop. And there are two things that he said that really got me going and changed my life. The most interesting part of it was that he said that there's something called, when there's trauma, there's something that happens that takes over if we are overwhelmed, if we're traumatized, and he called it the trauma vortex. But at the same time, the moment that the trauma vortex happens, there's an inherent capacity to heal called the healing vortex that emerges at the same time. And when it's stuck, we just need to reactivate it. And I thought, oh my goodness, it means that we all have a built-in capacity to heal. That's going to be much more important and easier to heal trauma at the collective level because of that. So that was the first point.
Great, lots we can go into here. So let me hear a bit about your own life. I mean, did you grow up in Israel or the United States? Like, help me understand the biology here, the biography here a little bit.
Yeah, so I was born in Syria, Aleppo.
Okay.
And as a baby, there was trouble against the Jews because of the partition of Palestine that was announced at the UN. And we got on a plane. My mother's cousin chartered a plane from Lebanon, sent it to us, and few families escaped. And we were the last plane to leave before they closed the door on the Jews for 15 years at the time. Wow. So as a baby, he ended up in Lebanon. We had a wonderful life there. We were very well received. My father was doing well. We were very well integrated. And then in 1958, the civil trouble started, and there was a bomb against a building in the street that we lived. And the army came in, and there were posts. I remember the scene very well. I was 11 years old. And my mother said, okay, out of here. And in 2 days, we left Lebanon. And we had our picture taken in Turkey when we were coming out of the plane, because we were the last plane to leave before the American troops arrived in Lebanon. So that was twice doing that. I ended up spending a year in Italy and Switzerland, waiting for our papers to move to Brazil. And then we moved to Brazil, and there I attended a French school, the Lycée Pasteur, and was living a good life there too. And then I decided to move to Israel on a scholarship of art scholarship. And I moved to Israel, and that's where I kind of left my heart there for a while. But then I met my husband to be in Israel and left Israel and came to live in the United States, became also a Canadian citizen because my husband was Canadian, and lived in Canada for a year, went around the world for a year, came back to LA. And I've been here since, but traveling very extensively to the Middle East.
Yeah, I mean, it's really nice. It's so nice to talk to someone with an international perspective. I mean, you're sort of the UN, aren't you, really? So it's often the perspectives come from just the United States of trauma teachers. So it's really nice to speak to someone that has that broader cultural perspective. Yeah. And I mean, I can see why you'd get interested in trauma with that background. But it sounds like you, first of all, you said you got interested in spirituality.
Right. I was really having a wonderful life. I was a therapist and I was interested in helping people become more spiritual. I was very innocent. I had no idea about the cost of trauma and what was really happening with it until I met it face to face. And then only later on, much, much later, I realized, well, my family went through traumatic events. You don't leave overnight a place where you've lived for centuries, your family and your antecedents lived for centuries there without having some price to pay for it. But I wasn't aware of it. Personally, I was not aware of it. Later on, I realized that there were some leftovers for the family, having to integrate into different countries. Although Lebanon was not difficult to integrate, that was very easy. But to go to Brazil, a new language with 8 kids and, living in the middle of the city and in a high rise instead of a house and all of that stuff was really difficult for my mother, I think. So I ended up actually living on 4 different continents. That's true.
Yeah. I'm also lived in different countries, so I find that fascinating. Mm-hmm. I'm an immigrant family myself. And if people don't understand how trauma can be a block to spirituality, how would you explain that? This is something I've come across before, but I think some people might not make that connection intuitively.
Yeah. So what happens when we get traumatized? And trauma, I would define it the way Peter Levine defines it. It's really excess energy stuck in the body and incompleted movements of defense when there was a threat. And then what happens with that is that your nervous system gets dysregulated. And so all of your abilities, there's a loss of control and a big sense of helplessness. And so your ability to function at all the layers of your life, whether it's emotional or the thinking process or at the activity level too, is compromised. So what we realize is that if I'm really worried about my safety and I'm really worried about the world not being a safe place for me at all, I'm not really thinking about spirituality and connection with the divine or connection with the world or unity with other people. I'm preoccupied with my fear and my mistrust level. And all. Yeah, and the survival level at the emotional level too. We're not even talking about the physical level because you can be surviving fine at the physical level and you've got a job and you've got the money to survive and you have food on your table and a roof over your head and you're sending your kids to school, but nevertheless, your mind is not available for the bigger picture. It's available for survival, as you said, at the emotional level. Something is amiss. And that's when I realized that if people are traumatized, they just could not be in that space of centeredness, of evenness with oneself, and of deep connection with the self that allows us to radiate outwards towards the world and towards the bigger picture. That's where it came from at the time.
That makes sense. The other thing I've come across, and tell me if you've also experienced this, is people sort of using spirituality as a way to try and bypass trauma, as a way to sort of up and out, transcend the trauma, sort of get away from the body and the emotions, and that sort of particular strand of body denying trauma, body denying spirituality also seems connected in almost the opposite way as well, right? People go heavily into sort of more esoteric practices when they've had trauma sometimes.
Yeah, but that's true for everything. So every single activity that we engage in, like people who exercise 4 or 5 hours a day, people who work unbelievable hours, people who will get into any activity in an unbalanced way. So my sense that maybe the most interesting part of Kabbalah that I really understood is the trauma is about the lack of balance. So even if we're doing an activity that's supposed to be good and is good by itself, if we're out of balance with it, then it's not helping us. If I'm using the spirituality to not resolve my problems, then it's not helping me. If I'm using the spirituality to help me with my trauma, then it's another question altogether. So it's fascinating that people who were actually had faith and were believers were much less traumatized than other people. So faith can really help you keep your resources and overcome your trauma for sure. But this is if your nervous system is balanced enough for you to be able to do that. But if the nervous system is totally off balance, then you get into a polarity of activity, either too much or too little. And it's the lack of balance that ends up hurting people.
The way I look at it is any activity that we see someone doing, we don't actually know if it's healthy or unhealthy, if they're meditating or doing yoga or exercising or eating or whatever, because it really depends. Are they using it as a sort of self-regulatory mechanism and maybe, that's the only thing they've got to survive? Are they using it as a way not to feel, to numb out, to be, exercising so hard they don't feel their emotions or whatever? We don't actually know unless we were to look at the big picture of their life and how they're using that activity, right?
Yes, no, absolutely. We have to look at the balance that's going on. And yet, I would say, if you are overriding trauma by being extra spiritual, I prefer that than by you being violent or being isolated or being, Like there's still resources that we overuse that would be more beneficial than others, even if we're overriding our feelings and the experiences in our body. So as long as we're not harming other people or harming ourselves, I think that still can count. I have seen Holocaust survivors, for example, who have learned how to manage the experience of the Holocaust and have led very, very, very constructive lives, really functional lives. And when I wanted to take them into the body, they really didn't want to go there. And I ended up really respecting it, because it's like, if you have managed in whatever resources your parents gave you to overcome something as horrific as that experience, who am I to come and tell you, you have to go into your body in the way that I believe in? So I've become very skeptical of anything in absolute, including the use of the body. I think the body is amazing. It's an amazing tool of healing. It's an amazing tool for revealing the unconscious for us. When you go into your body, you can discover everything, all the implicit memories of trauma, all the resources that got buried, the gold and the dust at the same time. And so that's very useful, very helpful. Of course, if we learn how to do it in the right way, otherwise we get overwhelmed.
Yeah, I mean, the body can become a kind of northern tyranny, right? Like we're supposed to work with the body, or you have to feel. And as you say, if somebody is really coping well already and they're living a good life, then why push them to something?
Right, exactly. But the majority of us can really use the body as a healer and learning about it, because it's very simple, actually. The way Peter Levine brought it into the world is really very simple. It's very organic. It's very extraordinary. He unraveled something that actually we're born with, something that's built into our system, that we actually know how to discharge and release trauma, except when we get overwhelmed and too much too fast happen for us to be able to digest it, then we have to help it work again. We have to help the system, those mechanisms, function again in the right way. But it's there and it's built in, and why not get acquainted with it and use it whenever we can? There are many more people who are under stress and traumatized than people who are functioning very well because they repress the body. That's a few of people have been able to do that. I just don't want to be absolutist in anything. That's all. But other than that, for the majority, I think the body is an extraordinary tool. But again, I want to stress, I'm talking about the body, mind, and not just the body. This is very important for me.
What do you mean by that distinction? Sorry, if you could say a bit more.
Well, because, for example, there's a connection between all of the different parts of ourselves. Like what we think will produce certain feelings, will produce certain sensations, will produce certain impulses to act on what we have felt, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a connection between all of those aspects all the time. So for me to just work on the body, like, oh, I'm feeling my heart is beating fast, let me just see, and quiet it down, and that's all there is to it, it's not enough. I need to know where did that come from, and how did it change my thinking pattern that was bringing that stress in the first place? So understanding how to combine body, mind, that they are connected all the time, and that we can have our body speak to us and we can speak to our body, vice versa. The two-way street, I thought, was a very important thing to add to the field of bodywork, because the mind is also an extraordinary piece that we have. So I don't want to neglect any of the pieces. I just want to put them together to see them as a unity that allows us to go into our full power, the power of our mind and the power of our intuition and the power of our healing body. The body is a healer.
I like this emphasis in somatic experiencing on, the body does have a natural healing urge. And how do you encourage that or support that where that's kind of gone wrong? Like, let maybe start with some basics here of what would be helpful for people.
So I've put together, by the way, a video of 15 minutes that explain, which I ended up calling Emotion Aid, that my institute created, and that we are giving for free to the world since COVID. It wasn't supposed to be free, but we decided to just give it out. And so you can make it available for your people if you want to eventually. But if I go through the basics of Emotion Aid and the basics of somatic experiencing, because Emotion Aid is the part of somatic experiencing that can be used by the lay public, okay? It's the same thing, but by the lay public. Somatic experiencing was designed for trauma specialists that really work with very deep trauma. So it's a little bit of a different accent in there. So basically, what it maintains is that stress hormones, that is stuck in the body through a freeze response, because we've not been able to defend ourselves by fleeing or fighting in the appropriate way. And that freeze, that energy that's stuck in the system because of the freeze, when the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branches of our nervous system are not working in a complementary way anymore, but they're stuck together, becomes symptoms. And so we have symptoms at all levels, at the belief system, at the emotional level, where we can overreact to everything or underreact to everything, at the behavioral level, where we have addictions, impulsive behavior, etc. But the place to access that stuck energy the most directly possible is the body, the sensation level, the inner sensation. For example, let's say I think about a danger or something that's dangerous or upsetting that happened to me, and then I notice what comes up in my body. I have fear. So where's the fear? My heart is beating fast. I have a lump in my throat. My chest is tight, and I have butterflies in my stomach. So these four sensations right now just indicated my fear. And I can use those four sensations to go in the body and discharge them. And this is where the magic of what we were given at birth is really working. If I take one sensation at a time and I only notice it without criticism, without evaluation, very neutral attention, like an anthropologist, and I just put my attention on my heart beating fast, okay? Takes a couple of seconds. And the next thing that will happen, there will be a discharge sign that will take away that strong heartbeat and take it back to normal. And the discharge signs are a deep breath that comes by itself, a yawn, trembling or shaking, but at the light level inside of the body, not a big tremble, heat wave, warm sweat, gurgling of the stomach, and goosebumps. Any one of those signs coming up, which is autonomic, we're not doing it on purpose, is involuntary. So sometimes we get scared and we stop it, but we shouldn't stop it. We should just let it be. And then that sensation just disappears. We just cleaned up that one little piece of activation, of traumatic activation that was still stuck in the body. And the concept that Peter brought in that I thought was a genius concept that should be applied everywhere is the concept of titration, which is used in chemistry, where if you combine two explosive products together in a very homeopathic way, a little bit at a time, you get a very healing third product instead of the explosion. If I go into my body and I focus on all my sensations at the same time, what's going to happen? I'm going to get more traumatized and more activated. But when I take them only one at a time and I focus on it, this is called titration. I'm taking the smallest piece of activation possible, which is a sensation. It gets discharged. It goes away from my body and I go to the next one and I do the same thing. And the next one and I do the same thing. Is that clear?
It is making sense to me. How would this work practically for people? Maybe you can give an example, a sort of daily life example of using these kind of principles.
So, for example, I'm working with a lady who has a fear of cats. And so I have her think about the cat, and she feels a panic in her throat and in her heart. And I take her to the throat, for example, or to the heart to notice it. And she's amazing. She just discharges on the spot. Breath after breath, yawn after breath, yawn after yawn. It's beautiful, beautiful process. She's amazing. And then I take to the next one. And after I discharge all of the sensations, I bring the topic again and see what else emerges, right? And so as I see what's emerging, then there's more sensations that come up. I also help them discharge. And then I bring again the topic of fear and I help discharge until there is nothing left. So sometimes it takes a while, depending on how much this trauma has been connected to other things. So it might take a few sessions. Sometimes something fearful like that can go in one session. Like I helped people with fear of flying in one session. And the next day they were already traveling after 30 years of not going on a plane. So it depends on what else is connected with it. So if I notice a feeling, so the good thing about it is that I need to learn to notice what's the first sign of activation that I feel. What's the first sign? Oh, I feel a sinking feeling in my heart, or my chest tightens up, or my heart beats fast, or I lose my breath. My breath gets short. So any one of my signs that I see that this is me reacting, then I immediately stop whatever I'm doing and I go into the sensation and I help discharge it. Now, because we have so much unconscious stuff going on, if, for example, I felt something like, a hole in my stomach right now, and I don't know what just happened, then I have to track down as I think about the sensation. Is there a thought or an image that comes up? Oh, yeah, something flashed on the screen where was a car accident. And maybe that triggered my own car accident from a few years ago. Or something flashed, or somebody said a sentence, or there was a music on the radio that I heard many years ago when I was upset about something. So the body is going to help us release, but at the same time, if we focus on the information that it brings up, is going to tell us what's going on with us, what happened in our past. And so little by little, those aspects start connecting together. And every time I have one more gap filled up about my trauma, because that's what trauma does, right? Trauma makes us disconnect so that we can cope. But then the disconnection is with us and it's doing its ravages underneath. So by bringing up those connections and discharging them immediately, releasing them as soon as we have them, then we are accomplishing our healing. We don't need to keep them unconscious anymore, because unconsciousness is actually a resource, right?
So those implicit sort of unconscious things, we gradually, almost a kind of curious detective work of figuring things out and go, oh, okay, there's something there, kind of filling in the gaps, isn't it, in a way, this kind of healing?
Right.
quick break from the interview to tell you about our shop and a deal we've got on there, and also about some events that are coming up. So if you go to Embodied Facilitator/shop and use the code podcast 50 is the code, you can get 50% off anything in the shop. And what have we got on there? How to design training, trauma for facilitators, breath work, leadership, resilience, life purpose. There's a bunch of books, there's a bunch of e-courses, mostly for facilitators, trainers, coaches, yogis, different ebooks. But that code will give you 50% out off anything at all there in the shop. So that could save you, let's say, up to £100, which is about $120. So well worth having that code. Go to embodiedfacilitator.com/shop. Also on that website, you will see embodiedfacilitator.com/events-calendar. Just look under events under the main title. You'll see all the stuff we've got coming up for events. We regularly have free online events. If you're interested in embodiment, we have them on coaching, life purpose, marketing, all trauma, all sorts of things. So have a look at the events page. You can see the different one-day events we've got coming up related to the conference and all kinds of other stuff. Okay, so all of that is on embodiedfacilitator.com. And remember that code there. That code is podcast50 if you want 50% off anything. There you go. A good deal. Back to the interview.
It gives us back our narrative, our history, what happened to us. And we're curious animals that way. We really need to have a coherent story about our lives. And when there's disconnection, it's very hard to have that clarity and to have that sense of well-being that clarity brings us. So that's where I think the healing of trauma is so important, beyond the fact that it really harms us physically and emotionally and mentally. A lot of paranoia and a lot of polarization exists because of trauma. And that's why we go into the whole...
How does this relate to peace? So you've indicated that, people being stuck in fight and flight, you have this background in the Middle East. I'm very interested in the topic of how it can lead to conflict, both the United States, Europe, and the Middle East, different levels of conflict maybe, but maybe you could speak a bit about that.
Yeah. It's really all over the world. I mean, when I took Peter to Israel, I really thought it was like the Israeli-Palestinian problem, And then I studied the whole thing, and it wasn't only the Palestinian-Israeli problem. It was the religious problem between the Arabs and the Muslims and the Jews, and what it meant to have somebody in the Middle East that was autonomous or not. And then I realized it's not only that. And I have a very interesting piece on my website called The Missing Piece, PIECE, in the conflict of the Middle East, and all the amazing vortices that are impacting it. Like, they are worldwide. This is not a simple problem at all. It's not a territorial problem only at all. And so when I thought, okay, I'll bring SE to Israel, and then we'll make peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, it seemed like to be like a piece of cake, right? No big deal. And then I, became aware of the extents of the problem. And then now we know that we have trauma all over the world. And I remember my doctor telling me, when you first came to ask me if I would donate to your cause, I thought, this poor woman, her and her trauma. And then he said, and now I realize that you were a prophetess, because trauma is the middle name of all of us right now. And it's true. Trauma is all over. So it's something much bigger. So this is the part of what I was saying before, is that when we're not balanced, when we're traumatized, and we are worried about our safety, we are mistrustful, we can get to be paranoid even, we can get to be very polarized. There's very little tolerance for differences. Everything becomes very threatening. Everything gets triggered. Everything that's different becomes a trigger for us. And so instead of engaging in dialogue because of the mistrust, there is more the engagement in a conflict. Now, conflict, by definitions, are fine. Conflicts are a sign that something needs to be resolved, something needs to be addressed. It's not a big deal. But when conflict is not resolved, or when conflict is coming from trauma, and then it becomes durable, like people cannot get rid of it, they cannot solve it, then at that point it turns into violence and war and brutality. And the more I polarize myself against the other, I am likely to demonize the other. The more I demonize the other, the less I care about them as human beings, and the easier it becomes for me to be brutal against them, because they're not human beings anymore. I don't see them that way anymore. And that's what trauma does at the collective level. And that's my concern right now. And I'm finishing right now my last book about this, about conflict resolution and collective trauma. Because if we understand that trauma is involved, and if we learn what are the first signs of a traumatized polity, then we can intervene much earlier before the trauma explodes into a violent trauma vortex. That's my whole involvement.
One of my Israeli friends, I've been there many times, he says Israeli politics will look very different when our politicians aren't traumatized war heroes. And he says once people understand the symptoms of trauma, they're going to be electing very different politicians, because they'll see it and they'll say, hey, this is a bit dangerous. Maybe we don't want to elect this guy because, he's got these symptoms and maybe he needs treating, rather than projecting it onto others or seeing the world in terms of these, fight or flight, super dangerous. And the other thing was interesting. I spoke to another Israeli friend of mine who was an ex-Israeli Special Forces and now is a trauma therapist, Adi. He's been on the show. And he said, right now, you're all like Israelis. He said, with COVID and with politics in America, he said, you're all Israelis now. I understand you're like me now. Everybody's building walls and getting paranoid and attacking each other. And he was joking, but I was like, Ari, there's some truth in this, Like we've, as a world, have almost taken on this way of being at the moment.
Right. Yeah, there are two things. I just did a webinar, really, really interesting about the Holocaust by bullet, about Babin Yar commemoration, 80th anniversary of the Babin Yar massacre that happened in 1941, where they just killed people by shooting them.
In the Ukraine? Was it the Ukraine?
Yeah, in Ukraine, right. I just finished it now. We Monday, this Monday was the launching of it. If you're interested, I can send you the website. It was really fascinating. And I was on a panel about collective trauma. They really wanted to know about that and repressed memories and what to do. And so I've been writing a lot about anti-Semitism. And when does it start flourishing again? When does it start rising up again? Is when a culture is in trouble, when there's things that are not going okay. There are forces that are not being responded to. There are dissatisfactions. There are unhappiness. There are neglect of certain populations that people are not paying attention to. And then they get surprised that there is trouble, that it manifests this way. But of course, it's going to manifest in some ways. And anti-Semitism is one of the absolute first signs of trouble in a culture, which is, I wrote an article at the time that anti-Semitism is not the problem of the Jews anymore only at all. It's really the problem of the community of nations, of the international community, because it has a meaning that is way beyond Jewish populations. I mean, you get anti-Semitism rise in countries that don't even have Jews. So it's a meme. It has become a meme of hatred and violence and dissatisfaction. So I'm looking at this part of it, at this kind of trauma that people are not understanding. And the other thing I wanted to share with you is that 20 years ago, I think it was 20 years ago, but I was introduced to Shimon Peres. I had a meeting with him. At the time, he had just become foreign minister. And I had presented him my model, and he thought it was fascinating, and he wanted to take it to the Knesset. He actually wanted to take the model that I designed for conflict resolution, to understand the needs behind it, to the Knesset and do something there. And then the Intifada broke out, and our mutual efforts just got completely derailed, and that was it for it. But that was
just for listeners who don't know, the Knesset is the Israeli parliament. A lot of our listeners won't know that. So yeah. Wow, that would have been an amazing thing, huh? If that had been put into
But that's what I'm proposing, that's what the UN should do. And that's what every single international organization should do, is really look at the impact of trauma on everything that's happening in every country that is showing signs of trouble, whether they are attacking or demonizing other cultures or other nations or other groups, whatever is happening, or whether there's anti-Semitism or whether there is a rise in racism, whatever is happening that is troubling to the international community, we should look at, okay, what just happened? Instead of just demonizing the perpetrators or the people who are acting out, like, watch out, just start questioning what's going on and how can we help them get out of their trauma vortex. And I think that if those parameters were to be applied on a regular basis with an agreement among the different nations, that those are measures that people agree that that's what it shows. And it's a little bit difficult because everything is so politicized today, you know. There's so many.
I'm hopeful, Gina. I do feel very hopeful that this work around trauma is becoming more widely known. I spoke to a woman who works with young people in America yesterday, Jennifer Trevelli, who was at the conference as well. Paul Linden's work on embodied peace building was a very obscure thing, and now more and more people are finding out about it. You know, I think there will be, it may take a little while, and maybe we don't have enough time, but I feel like this work will spread to politicians, to healthcare professionals, to people who work in the UN. I feel it will spread, and I've got that hope really in the 20 years I've been in this area, seeing it go from an obscure, weird thing, and now people like Peter Levine or Gabor Mate, they're sort of rock stars. They're kind of famous because it's such a big area, and that gives me a lot of hope.
Right, I agree with you. I agree with you because I believe in hope beyond hope. It's like, even when hope is not there, I think we need to have hope. But I am aware with my studies for my book and also just looking at the history of the Jews themselves, you know, I'm very aware that history is very cyclical, and there will be periods of trauma vortex, and there'll be periods of healing vortex at the collective level too, worldwide. And I think the question for us is to make sure that we minimize the impact of the trauma vortex as much as possible. I do not see, I mean, when you think about that, after the Holocaust wasn't even dry from the blood yet, that we allowed the genocide to happen in Rwanda, that we allowed the Syrian war, the million people killed, or they stopped counting after 500,000, you know. All of the things that are happening around the world, all of the conflicts happening around the world, I don't believe that we're there yet. I believe that it will take a long time, but I think that if we can minimize as much as possible and resource people as much as possible. And I think this is where the body really becomes a big, big resource that we have. Like, if programs like yours, if every single person that's conscious and understanding the bigger picture were to promote people doing their own healing, then we don't have these huge collective pressures on the leaders, on the nation's leaders. Act out what's going on in their countries. They make it happen, but they also act out. So it's very important to look at the bigger picture, at the full picture. And also, it's like, when there's collective trauma that doesn't get resolved, it will reemerge maybe a century later, but it will reemerge, or 2 centuries later. So this is where, even like when something happened, and it happened catastrophically, and then you get over it and some healing gets done. But if the full healing is not done, it will reemerge again. So not only do we have to be aware, not only do we have to be aware of the impact of trauma behind everything, but we have to commit to an extensive type of healing efforts after traumas happen. Because if they're not dealt with, they go underground and they sneak out on us all of a sudden, and we say, what the hell just happened? Where did this come from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes I feel like history is not quite a circle, but more like a spiral. There is a sort of upward positive movement, but there's also things that go around in circles. And as you say, if things aren't addressed, they come out in other ways. And I feel like we are living in a time in history where there is at least a possibility of understanding, the possibility of resources, information being spread on the internet. So thank you for all your good work and, all the things you put out there. This is a special kind of place in my heart around this trauma work, particularly in the Middle East. So, thank you for your part in that. I think many of us play a part and don't necessarily know the fruits of our efforts, do we? We don't necessarily know how they blossom.
No. But there's one more thing I wanted to share with you if we have time. Do we have another minute?
We have 5 minutes, yeah.
Oh, okay. So I designed something, you know about Yad Vashem, like the righteous Gentiles that saved the Jews during the Holocaust. Okay. So my sense is that we need to create an equivalent to Yad Vashem, an organization for nations that have been perpetrators, but that follow a very close regimen of healing and get them out of having been a perpetrator. It's like, if you do this, if you recognize, because if you recognize what you've done, you repair it, but you also work towards prevention of it happening again, whether with you or the nations around you. You now deserve to be among the righteous nations and leave your perpetrator status behind you. Because if you don't get that kind of healing, it will emerge again. There is shame fatigue. There is guilt fatigue that happens to people. And we need to address this, and we need to use the body and something like somatic experiencing and many other techniques, by the way, that emerged about 20 years ago altogether, short term, that help people discharge. Like, don't teach Holocaust history without teaching people how to discharge the feelings that they get from it.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder what it must be like to be a German child and be taken to the museums in Germany, which is very well intended. And it's something the Japanese don't do actually for their genocides. Right. There is a big difference between those nations. But imagine that as a child being taken to those museums without any resources and being told, like, your grandparents did this.
I was in Rwanda and I went to the Kigali Center. And they had images of the massacre, of the genocide from the ground to the ceiling, all in colors, really, really, really violent. And I called the director and I said, so what goes on in here? I was so shocked by seeing that there have been several episodes there was a collective reenactment that happened. And I said, how are you teaching? What's happening when people come here? And he said, you're so correct, because people come here and then I have to stay with them. Like, out of 400 people that come in, 80 people I have to keep outside and talk to them for 3-4 hours until they can recompose themselves. So I said, if you're teaching this in the school, you need to teach it with the right tools. You need to give people the tools so that they understand something, they keep the memory of it, but they're not traumatized by it. So that their action then becomes positive and conscious, instead of either taking it into the unconscious again or being angry and acting it out.
When I first visited Yad Vashem, which is the main Holocaust Memorial Museum for listeners, when I was 15 years old, actually, with Jewish friends, I went to Israel for the first time, and it really had an impact on me. And it was I also, 2 years ago, went to Auschwitz. My wife was living in Krakow, so we visited Auschwitz, which is nearby. And it was such a different experience, going as a child effectively and being overwhelmed, and then going to another memorial, equally sort of horrific and many similar kind of displays of things, but going as someone resourced as an adult who had trauma training. And it was, an incredibly different experience, obviously, with those, 25 years difference in between. And it was very noticeable difference. Anyway, listen, this has been wonderful, but we do need to wrap up. Thank you so much for your time. Gina, where do people find your stuff? Where do people go? Any websites you want to point people to here?
Okay, so because I don't have, I can't share screen or anything like that with you right now. It's www.traumainstitute.org. And I'm trying to see what was and I think it's info@traumainstitute.org for information. But is there any way that I can send you the link to the emotion aid that people can access?
Yeah, you can send me the link and we will add that in with the resources. If people are listening to the podcast, sometimes they're not necessarily seeing links because it's on audio. So they can Google, what should they Google to find your work? What's the best thing to search?
I don't have that information right now. I can send it to you.
Okay, if you send it to us, then people can see that on the resources. So, Gina, we had some problems with sound today. It might well be because I'm in Mexico, so apologies if that was my end. I think you were perfectly articulate and clear though, so I think people would still have got some good content there. Just apologies to listeners if they could hear some echo on my voice, but I think the main part of it worked fine. So let's see if I can at least say goodbye to you there. Thank you so much for your time today, Gina.
Even if you just had this. Even if you just had one picture for a second of the two of us, that would be nice when you showed it. Well, I don't know if
maybe we can put a picture up. Let me see what I can do. Thanks for your time, Gina. I have to go now. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Some ways to get more, to give back, and to get more involved now. So the biggest request I have would be to share the podcast with your friends, people that you think would really enjoy it. Email it to them, put it on your social media, tell them about it, old school. Really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support us financially, you can go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/Embodiment Podcast and give us $1 an episode. And I'd say they're well worth $1. So that's less than £1 if you're in UK-ish. So yeah, please go there. On the embodiedfacilitator.com website is where this is hosted. Most people I think listen to for iTunes. iTunes, we'd certainly appreciate a review. The way iTunes works means that a review means more people will find it. iTunes regards it as more important for searches. So even a couple of sentences review really does help as a little thank you to us. And if you want to go to embodiedfacilitator.com, you can see the actual, links to the sites. There's comments on there. The Facebook group tends to be where people discuss things. So if you go to put in the Embodiment Podcast into Facebook, there's a page which is relatively quiet and a group which does have some discussion on. So I will reply to things personally there. So also on embodiedfacilitator.com website, there's all sorts of freebies there. There's videos, there's free ebooks, there's ebooks you can buy. And of course, there's our newsletter list. If you want to stay in touch and learn about things like the Embodied Facilitator Course and our next Embodied Yoga Principles teacher training, then go to that website and you'll see a little pop-up and you can get the newsletter through there. Okay, so I think they're the main ones. Tell your friends, pay us some money on Patreon, give us a review on iTunes, send us your email if you want to be on the newsletter list, and get involved on the Facebook there. Bit long. Pick whatever you like that works for you. Until next time, welcome home to the body.